Okay, guys, our Promethean board's not working and y'all need notes, and so this is how you're going to have to get them. For now, you're going to have to log into Google Classroom, which I told you to do, and I will be going over them with you through screencast. So the subject for today was the Vicksburg campaign, and your essential question is, how did the Vicksburg campaign affect the Civil War? So we're going to talk about the things leading up to that in the notes today. So we're going to back up to January 29th, 1863, even though the Battle of Vicksburg didn't actually start until later in May. We're going to have to talk about the things that happened between this January 29th date up to May. So 1863, Grant established his headquarters in North Vicksburg. It was in a location called Young's Point, which was a landing on the Mississippi River just north of Vicksburg, and established his headquarters there. That should be number one. So what happened was Grant had heard from Farragut, who had traveled up the Mississippi, that they couldn't take Vicksburg from the river because of the batteries, which are large guns that were set up for shooting at the ships from Vicksburg. They were taking out the ships that Farragut was selling. So Farragut, having learned from Farragut that Vicksburg could not be taken from the river, General Grant ordered General Sherman to dig a canal between the two main channels of the river. So his plan was to dig this canal, and they could travel their ships up and down without having to go through the actual city of Vicksburg. So the river was made into what we call a hairpin, which is a sharp bend at Vicksburg. The canal would have allowed for Union ships to bypass the batteries of Vicksburg and would have reopened the Great River to Midwestern trade. And this would allow for the Union to be able to take over or get supplies that they needed. But this didn't work. Farragut tried to continue up the river so he could help Sherman build these canals, but this failed, so Grant had to abandon this idea. So his next idea was to blow up a levee. He was going to blow up this levee. Levees are made out of soil, and so he said, I'll blow this up. We'll fill up an old channel that connected the Mississippi to Moon Lake, which was on the northeastern side of Vicksburg, and then that way we could travel with our troops on higher ground. All right, so after the attempt to dig the canal failed, General Grant set in motion another movement to get part of his army in a position in northeast Vicksburg. He ordered his men to dynamite the levee at a place called Yazoo Pass. The dynamite worked and the water filled up, but General Pemberton from the Confederacy was there waiting for him after this explosion, and so he had to retreat back. So number 6, after the Yazoo Pass expedition failed, General Grant designed a bold, daring, and dangerous maneuver to capture Vicksburg. Now, this plan that he put together next was probably the most dangerous thing that he could do, and the other generals and admirals and colonels didn't agree with what he wanted to do, but this was what he decided to do. What he came up with was he was going to march his troops down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River. So he wanted to cross his troops over the Mississippi River, travel south down the Louisiana side, cross them back over the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg. This was a plan that he came up with because the attack on the northern side of Vicksburg was below Vicksburg's bluff, and so he couldn't get a good entrance into the area that he needed to get into to take out the Confederate troops. But he believed that on the south side he could actually attack on land without a problem. So he decided, number 7, Grant decided to move his men down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River and cross over into Mississippi south of Vicksburg. It would be really difficult for him to do because he was going to have to transport his army, which was really large, from the Louisiana side back across the river into Vicksburg. And the only way he could be able to accomplish this was that he would have to get Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter to run his ships past the Vicksburg batteries and meet Grant south of the city. So he was going to have to start a diversion basically, like have somebody get people to divert what the Vicksburg Confederate soldiers were doing so he could get his troops down that Louisiana side. But he also needed to get Porter's ships through Vicksburg without damage. All right, so he told Sherman and Porter his plan, and they both said, this is crazy. We don't want to do this. We're going to lose our troops if we do it. And not only that, when you go across over into Louisiana, there is not going to be anybody there to help you, and your supplies are going to be cut off. So when the plan, number 10, the plan was dangerous, not just because marching through Louisiana and crossing over into Mississippi, Grant would be completely cut off from his army and from its supply lines. But Porter also was afraid, this is 11, he was dangerous because he believed that he could lose his entire fleet while trying to pass the big guns of Vicksburg. So Sherman and Porter were both like, we can't do this. But Grant knew that taking Vicksburg was the ultimate goal he needed to accomplish, because once Vicksburg fell from the Confederacy, the Union would have split the eastern and western sides of the Confederacy. So this was part of Lincoln's grand plan at the beginning of the war. This was step 3. And Grant knew that if they could complete step 3, then they would be well on their way to step 4. All right, so the way we were going to do this is he was going to actually cause a diversion. This is the idea that he wanted to take. He said if the Union Army could take Vicksburg, the Confederacy would be cut in half. Grant's grand maneuver was initiated on March 29, 1863. It started with what was called Grierson's Raid. Grierson was actually located in Tennessee. He told Grierson, I need you to march through Mississippi. I need you to take all eyes off of me and what I'm doing, and you need to get all of the Confederate troops paying attention to what you're doing. So Grierson starts marching through Mississippi. Now, he was marching through areas that had already fallen to the Union soldiers, and so he starts towards Jackson to travel in between Vicksburg and Jackson. The idea was to get soldiers in Vicksburg to pay attention to what was going on the eastern side of Vicksburg rather than the west where the river was located, and to get the people in Jackson who were in the army to pay attention to what was going on the western side of Jackson. So this allowed for not only Grierson to make a attempt to distract from the Mississippi River, but it allowed for distraction in Jackson, which allowed for Sherman to start marching towards Jackson to take that city. If you look, number 14, it says to cover himself as well as possible and to disguise his strategy, Grant devised several diversion attacks, and the most important diversion was Grierson's raid that Colonel Benjamin Grierson conducted from LaGrange, Tennessee, down through Mississippi, and then he was eventually going to march right on into Baton Rouge. This worked. Believe it or not, the idea worked. Grierson was going along as he got in between Jackson and Vicksburg. He did what he was supposed to do, and all of the Confederacy was focused on him and not what was going on in Jackson or on the Mississippi River. And while he was doing this, he actually destroyed the railroad line that connected Vicksburg to the eastern portion of the Confederacy, and allowed for them to not be able to get supplies into Vicksburg later on when they really needed them. So, number 16, the purpose of Grierson's raid was to cause General Pemberton to divert part of his army in pursuit of Colonel Grierson and to destroy the railroad lines that connected Vicksburg with the eastern part of the Confederacy. All right, so while this is going on, Grierson's raid, which started, like I said, in March and continued on, or excuse me, in April and continued on through May. On April 16th, Admiral Porter decides to run his gunboats. Because of the distraction, he could get his boats without much damage down the Mississippi River, and this is where he would be able to meet up with Grant. So, in the middle of the night, April 16th, 1863, Rear Admiral Porter's fleet of 8 gunboats and 2 transports, which had tons of soldiers inside of it, sailed past the big guns at Vicksburg, and here's the fun word, rendezvoused, which means they came together at an appointed place with Grant's troops south of the city. Rendezvous is spelled R-E-N-D-E-Z-V-O-U-S-E-D, because I know that y'all need help with spelling that. All right, so once this happened, it started to become the end of April, and Grant had accomplished what he wanted by moving his troops through Louisiana and back across the river. That was 24,000 men that he got across the river, down Louisiana, and back across the river. Now, just to give you a little perspective, 24,000, there are actually 400 students at Purvis Middle School. So that's a lot of people. I couldn't imagine trying to move everyone here at Purvis across a river, down Louisiana, and back across a river. So you can only imagine how difficult this was and why they had to be patient and it took so long. So Sherman, meanwhile, is over in Jackson, taking over Jackson. And that is where we're at in our notes. So Union assault was going to happen, and they knew this. Jefferson Davis figured out that Grant had not been around, so he told Pemberton he needed to reinforce his army. So Pemberton sent word to Johnston, and Johnston was supposed to bring 10,000 additional troops into Vicksburg to help Pemberton with this potential or could possibly happen attack that was coming from Grant. Well, Grant had spies, and these spies realized, oh, hey, they're fixing to add more troops. Well, he didn't want that to happen. So Grant and Sherman went to Jackson. When they got to Jackson, they burned down everything. They ripped up railroads, and they pretty much stopped Johnston's troops from being able to meet up with Pemberton's troops. So in anticipation of a Union assault against Vicksburg, President Jefferson Davis ordered 10,000 Confederate troops under General Joseph E. Johnston to reinforce General Pemberton. When Grant learned that the Confederate reinforcements were on their way to Jackson, he captured the city to prevent General Johnston from linking his troops with Pemberton's forces. So now Pemberton is in between Jackson and Vicksburg. He is going that way to try to save Johnston's troops. Runs up on the Union soldiers. He wasn't prepared for that. So this is the Battle of Champion Hill, which is actually the start of the Siege of Vicksburg, which started on May 16th, 1863. When they met up, he was not prepared, and he didn't have all of his troops with him. Pemberton didn't. So the Union were able to defeat them quite easily, and they chased the Confederate soldiers. Pemberton told them to retreat into the walls of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was fortified with walls back then, and so he and several citizens and his military men all retreated back. So General Pemberton was ordered to concentrate his troops between Vicksburg and Jackson to prevent Grant from moving into Vicksburg. On May 16th, the two armies met at Champion Hill in what has been called the decisive battle of the Vicksburg campaign. When Pemberton withdrew his army into the city, he made a fatal mistake, and that mistake was that retreat, which we will pick up with tomorrow in class. So maybe I'll have my Promethean board back, maybe I won't. Either way, y'all are good at doing this note taking from Google, so we're going to keep it up. All right, see y'all later.